Richard Coleman froze in the doorway, his morning coffee trembling in his hand. Across the yard, his gray tabby Max trotted proudly toward the porch, a soaked $100 bill clenched between his teeth. The sight was so bizarre, so out of place in Richard's quiet suburban neighborhood, that for a moment he wondered if he was still dreaming. It wasn't the first time. All week, Max had been dropping damp, crumpled bills onto the front steps as casually as if they were mice. Now the porch was littered with them, green paper darkened by water stains, edges curling where they dried in the sun. The pile looked ridiculous, like some strange offering laid at Richard's feet. His pulse quickened. Where on earth could his cat be getting this kind of money? It wasn't pocket change either. It was hundreds, soggy and real. Richard's hands grew clammy as his mind scrambled for explanations. When he finally saw where it came from, the thought looped in his head. He had no choice but to call the police. But why? Was Max stealing from a neighbor? Had someone stashed their savings and lost it? Or was something far darker hidden nearby, waiting to be uncovered? Richard Coleman lived the kind of life most would call ordinary. A single man in his 40s, he worked steady hours at a local hardware store and spent his evenings tending the small garden behind his modest house. The quiet rhythm of the neighborhood suited him. His one real companion was Max, a spirited gray tabby with a mischievous streak. Max was the sort of cat who loved prowling the edges of lawns, chasing insects, and proudly depositing the occasional field mouse at Richard's feet. Nothing about him suggested that trouble or mystery would ever come slinking onto the porch. That changed one damp Tuesday morning. Richard stepped outside to grab the newspaper and nearly tripped over a soggy wad of green on the steps. Bending down, he blinked. It was a crumpled, water-stained bill. Max sat beside it, tail swishing proudly, as if expecting praise. Richard chuckled. "What did you do, Max? Rob a lemonade stand?" He brushed it off as some neighborhood prank or a fluke, but the next morning another bill appeared. Then another. Within days, a small pile of damp currency had formed on the porch. Richard stopped laughing. The neighbors began whispering, pointing when they passed. One asked half-jokingly if he'd won the lottery. Richard's stomach tightened. This wasn't funny anymore. Was Max dragging home stolen money? Was someone using his cat as bait, luring him into something dangerous? Each time he picked up the bills, their strange dampness unsettled him. Why were they always wet, like they'd been pulled from water? The question gnawed at him late into the night. How could a house cat keep finding cash, and why did every bill seem to carry the same eerie signature, wrinkled, crumpled, soaked through? Something was off, terribly off, and Richard knew he couldn't ignore it much longer. The strangeness didn't stop. It only deepened. One afternoon, Max came trotting across the yard again, a bill clenched in his mouth. This one looked worse than the rest. The corner was torn clean off, and as Richard picked it up, a sharp, acrid smell clung to his fingers. He wrinkled his nose and rubbed his hand on his jeans, but the odor lingered. It wasn't just old money smell, it was something harsher, chemical, like bleach or fuel. For the first time, a chill slid down Richard's spine. The next morning, he found another bill. This one was streaked with dried mud, like it had been dragged through a swamp or a drainage ditch. Richard turned it over under the porch light, the brown stains smudging his skin. His pulse quickened. The image of Max crawling into some foul, hidden place made his stomach churn. He didn't sleep that night, tossing in bed, his thoughts circling like vultures. Where was Max finding this? And why did each clue seem more sinister than the last? By the third night, Richard's worry had overtaken his curiosity. He noticed Max was staying out longer, sometimes vanishing for hours before padding back with his prizes. Enough was enough. Richard rummaged through an old box of electronics in the garage and pulled out a small GPS tracker he'd once bought for hiking trips. He clipped it to Max's collar with trembling hands, muttering, "Let's see where you're really going, buddy." The following evening, Richard sat glued to his phone screen, watching the tiny dot move across the map. At first, it looked innocent. Max lingered in backyards, darted through alleys, climbed fences. But then the dot pushed farther, past the neat rows of homes, past the gas station, slipping toward the edge of town. Richard frowned. Max was traveling much farther than he thought possible, nearly a mile out, toward a patch of abandoned farmland. His heart drummed harder when the signal finally stopped, near an old drainage pipe beneath a lonely stretch of highway. Richard's gut twisted. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, he set out on foot, following the route the tracker traced. The air grew cooler as he crossed into overgrown fields, weeds whispering against his jeans. Every snap of a twig made him flinch. Ahead, the trees thinned, revealing cracked pavement and the gaping mouth of a culvert pipe. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of passing cars and the faint rustle of tall grass. Then, movement. His flashlight beam caught a flash of gray fur. Max was there, pawing furiously at the edge of the pipe, tail lashing as if he'd cornered some treasure. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He crept closer, boots crunching on gravel, his flashlight sputtering. The beam jumped, then steadied, illuminating Max, tugging at something dark and slick. Richard crouched, heart hammering, and raised his phone to shine its weaker light into the tunnel. The darkness seemed to swallow it at first. Then shapes emerged, plastic glinting, edges folded tight, something wedged deep inside. His stomach lurched violently. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over the uneven ground, his chest tightening as if a vice had clamped around his ribs. Whatever was hidden in that drainage tunnel wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped the phone as he fumbled for the keypad. What had Max uncovered? What was packed so tightly into that pipe that made Richard's skin prickle and his blood run cold? And most of all, what could possibly be so disturbing that it left him with only one option: to call the police? Richard's thumb hovered over the phone for a moment before he forced himself to dial 911. His voice shook as he tried to explain. "My cat. He's been bringing home cash, wet bills. I followed him, and there's something in the drainage pipe. You need to send someone." There was a pause. The dispatcher's tone carried a trace of disbelief. "Sir, did you just say your cat is stealing money?" Richard squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the phone tighter. "I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you, there's a bag full of something down here, and it stinks of chemicals. Please, just send someone." 20 minutes later, headlights washed over the cracked road. 2 squad cars pulled up, tires crunching gravel. Richard stood by the culvert, hands jammed in his pockets, Max rubbing against his leg as if nothing were wrong. The first officer stepped out, brow furrowed. "All right, mister, where's this miracle money-making cat of yours?" Richard pointed toward the pipe. "In there!" "That's where he's been going." The officers exchanged skeptical looks, but drew their flashlights. The beams pierced the darkness, revealing the glint of black plastic deep inside. One officer muttered under his breath, then hissed, "Oh, hell." Call for backup. Richard's stomach dropped. They waded carefully into the culvert, boots sloshing in shallow water, and dragged the bag free. It hit the pavement with a wet slap, reeking of chemicals so sharp Richard gagged. Drops of foul water seeped out, spreading in dark streaks across the road. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice cracking. "I swear I didn't know." "My cat. He just kept bringing me bills. I thought it was a joke." "Relax, sir," one officer said firmly, though his jaw was tight. "Nobody's blaming you." But this is serious. By now, neighbors had gathered on the roadside, murmuring, their faces lit eerily by flashlight beams and squad car strobes. One officer slit open the bag with a knife. The plastic peeled back with a sucking sound. Richard's breath caught. Inside, bundled stacks of cash filled the bag to the brim, each wrapped tight with rubber bands. The green edges gleamed under the harsh white light. The officer exhaled a low whistle. Well, looks like your cat's been delivering pocket change from a fortune. Richard swayed on his feet, dizzy. The porch piles, the damp bills, it all hit him at once. Max hadn't been bringing home stray scraps. He'd been dragging fragments of a massive hidden stash. Richard's knees buckled, and he leaned hard against the patrol car for support, eyes locked on the money. He could only whisper, "Oh, God, what did you find, Max?" By morning, the cul-de-sac was buzzing. Patrol cars had come and gone through the night, and neighbors traded theories over fences. Richard barely slept, replaying the image of that dripping black bag every time he closed his eyes. At sunrise, a detective knocked on his door. Clipboard in hand, he carried the weight of authority, the kind that made Richard's throat dry. "The crime lab finished processing the evidence," the detective said, stepping into the kitchen where Max sprawled innocently on the counter. That bag held just over $40,000. Richard blinked, stunned. 40,000? The detective nodded gravely. Drug traffickers' money. Every bill was coated with a masking chemical designed to throw off K9 units. They tried to ditch it during a highway checkpoint last week. We've been looking for that drop ever since. Richard felt the color drain from his face. His cat hadn't stumbled into some harmless stash. He'd been dragging pieces of a major trafficking case onto the porch, right under everyone's nose. The detective glanced at Max, who was licking his paw as though this were all beneath him. Funny thing is, the chemical they used to repel dogs, it worked the opposite way on your cat, must have drawn him straight in. Richard pressed a hand to his forehead, the room spinning. The irony hit hard. Criminals had tried to outsmart trained police dogs, but instead they'd attracted a house cat. Within days, 2 suspects were arrested, linked directly to the abandoned stash. The story spread quickly, reporters calling Richard's phone, headlines flashing across local news. Cash Cat cracks case. Neighbors who once whispered now lined up to meet Max, snapping photos and laughing in disbelief. Richard, still pale from the revelation, could only shake his head. Max, oblivious to his new fame, continued to nap in sunny spots and bring home the occasional prize. But his days of carrying soggy bills were over. The police had cleared the culvert. Richard knew one thing for certain. His playful gray tabby had crossed into a world far darker than either of them could have imagined. And somehow, against all odds, he'd come out a hero. In the days that followed, word of Max's strange adventure spread far beyond the neighborhood. Some people laughed at the absurdity of it all, a house cat succeeding where drug dogs had failed. Others admitted they were shaken, realizing a dangerous trafficking ring had been operating right on their doorstep. Parents clutched their children tighter, while older neighbors shook their heads, muttering that you never really know what's hidden just beneath the surface of a quiet town. For Richard, the shock gave way to a strange pride. Standing on his porch one evening, he looked down at Max curling around his ankles and whispered, "I thought you were just a silly porch cat. Turns out you were chasing down criminals." The community seemed to agree. Neighbors began leaving toys, treats, even little bags of catnip by the gate, gifts for the unlikely hero who had dragged crime into the light. Kids called him Cash Cat and begged to see him, their giggles echoing down the block. Richard, however, chose a quieter tribute. He carefully pressed and framed the very first bill Max had ever dropped at his feet. It hung on his wall, a reminder of the day his ordinary life cracked open to reveal something extraordinary. And in quiet moments, Richard couldn't help but reflect. Sometimes the smallest pause lead us straight to the biggest secrets. Now he often wondered, if it had been you standing at that culvert, with your flashlight beam trembling on the darkness, what would you have done? Would you have followed Max inside that tunnel, or called for help right away?